Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. This will be my third lecture on isolated pawns. Again, for quite a few lectures, we'll be looking at isolated queen's pawns and the structures which follow from them. After that, we'll look at some other types of isolated pawns. But let me start out by going back and re-emphasizing the importance of the isolated queen pawn and why it receives the lion's share of attention in the literature. I want to make these lectures maybe relevant to what you do, so I'm going to show some major opening variations which produce an isolated queen pawn. I'm going to do this in a superficial and impressionistic way, manually, just to give a feel for the breadth of this phenomenon of this isolated queen pawn before returning to specific examples and game examples. So I'm going to run through some of these. You'll probably find that there's an isolated queen pawn position which arises in at least one and perhaps many of the openings that you play, and naturally I'm not going to mention them all because that's impossible. Okay, the books tend to emphasize openings with 1d4 which lead to isolated queen pawn. And there are indeed more examples of that than with 1e4, but let me show you a few isolated queen's pawns stemming from 1e4 first, as they are up on your screen. Now, the Sicilian defense is not known for isolated d pawns, but after the move c3, for example, there are actually a lot more, but this is probably the most common one. We will get several possibilities. For example, simply here, probably know these lines, may know these lines. This is just a standard C3 Sicilian. Here's one of the variations, and at this point probably, well, there's various ways to do this, but let's just go here, maybe castle here, and well, at some point this happens, and there we go. There's the isolated d pawn in a fairly normal position. You know, the rook can come to e1 and black can castle. This is fairly similar to what we've seen, the open d file and the blockading knight. A little bit like the d pawn case, not completely obviously, but the same principles, and maybe we'll see some of these games later. Let me go back a little bit there and look at another c3 line. The other main answer actually to c3 is d5, and you get this kind of position. And as you can probably see already, this can easily lead to an isolated pawn position. Just for example, well, there's so many ways to do this. I suppose this is one of them. Just some simple setup like this, and take, and there we go. There's the isolated d pawn. You know, it can finish like that, and maybe queen d6 is best, maybe queen d8. And here we go again, very similar. This time the knight is not already blockading, it's back here, but that's typical of the types of isolated pawn. This one's almost exactly like the normal example that we look at. Okay, so let me now go back and look at something else, some other, you know, there are other Sicilian defenses that maybe are worth kind of looking at. I'll tell you, whenever black plays the freeing move d5, we will see, often we'll see after e takes d5 an isolated pawn position. This is, for example, just out of many examples, this is the Spassky-Fischer game that ended their match, their World Championship match. And in fact, Fischer played here right now, and there we are. That happened, and I think something like this happened. But we got very typical isolated pawn positions when Fischer is black out of a Sicilian defense. So it's a little unusual, but not impossible at all. So let's take a look at maybe some e4, e5 positions. I think that would be interesting because e4, e5 is not usually associated with isolated d pawns, but you get a lot of them. So let's just goof around with that for a second. Well, knight c6 is normal. Let's look at the Petrovs first. And actually, there's quite a few that come from here. The one I was going to show you is, Well, there's a couple that are interesting here. Let me just show you this main line. It's probably the easiest. And then maybe just here, this one. There's plenty of options, as you know. It's not an opening theory course. And now there's lines with knight c6 and knight b4 where things get isolated. There's also just simple kind of positions like this where we end up with an isolated pawn. Like that. So it's a little different here because you'll notice this knight being here in front of the pawn is a little different, but it's the same idea. This pawn is isolated, gives white a lot of activity, files, and possibilities, attacking possibilities, maybe this kind of move, maybe some sort of pressure over here. Black is very solidly placed for the defense, and you get a typical isolated pawn position. Let's go back to, instead of the Petros, let's just play knight c6. And you can get all kinds of isolated pawn positions here too. I think let's first think about just old-fashioned thing. This is the Goring Gambit. And it can come up, this can come up from the Danish Gambit too, this kind of position, where we get an isolated pawn. So that's sort of a common Goring Gambit kind of position. You've probably seen this kind of thing before. Well, that's probably enough. Check here. And there's some famous Capablanca maneuver here, but we're not going to get too detailed. Here's the isolated pawn. White still gets, black's getting developed quickly here, but actually it's the same old idea. White's going to get some really strong activity pretty soon. Okay, and then what else can go on there that might be interesting? Well, instead of the Goring Gambit, I suppose, that also, by the way, that position comes up in the Chigorin defense to the Queen's Gambit declined. And there's always the Gioco Piano, which is probably the more familiar example, and that would go like this. And if you look at the old main line of the Gioco Piano, or one of them, you get a classic isolated pawn position. Some people claim is slightly better for white, and some people claim is equal. Okay, and black just blocks the center, and there it is. There's the isolated d pawn, and it's blockaded by that knight. White often goes here. Black can play knight a5, but we'll generally play here. White can castle, black can castle, and here you go. Here's your sort of standard isolated pawn. You might support it with that. White might use these files and get activity, maybe with the knight coming up. He's got a little more space to work with. Okay, standard stuff. So those are a couple d-pawn openings, e-pawn openings, and let's just see. As we saw last week, there are quite a few French defenses that lead to, well, there's a whole bunch of French defenses that lead there. What we looked at actually, well, here's a real quick one just to show you. Something like this can happen. It's very, very simple kind of position here, and I don't know. Let's just look at a few moves here. There are a lot of ways this can happen, but for example, maybe take here, and there it is. There's your isolated pawn position. Black might go like this and really try to blockade that square, and maybe protect it even more. And same old thing, white has a lot of activity, a lot of nice files, a lot of space, good activity, but black has this strong bind on the d5 square. What else in the French defense? We could look, well, look what we looked at last week. We looked at the Tarrasch variation. And I think what we looked at actually was this position. There's other ways that you can get an isolated pawn. And you can go back to last week to take a look at this. But anyway, there it is. There's the isolated pawn. White has the blockading square here. Maybe plays here, that kind of thing. So same sort of principles, just to show you that you can get these out of a lot of positions. It would also be interesting to look at one other French defense. Well, no, that's okay. There's several others that lead to this. And what does that lead to next? Well, there's the Caro-Kann variation, a very famous one you may have heard of. It's the Panov-Botvinnik attack, and this very often leads to isolated pawns. This main line, now there's other ways to play for black, and there's other ways that lead to isolated pawns, but this is sort of a familiar way of getting there, where, for example, black might play there, or even this is pretty common too, this kind of move. Often you'll get this. Isolated pawn, blockaded, white simply defends, bishop d2 or something. And often black will go back soon, and maybe even immediately, but he'll go back with the bishop, and then we'll get a very familiar kind of position. This kind of thing. And sometimes, actually, it's interesting, black will go back here and white will bring the bishop back here, and we've seen that kind of position before too. Okay, that's Caro-Can. What else do we have in the Caro-Can? Well, maybe out of the same variation, just another way of getting the same thing is for black to play there, and white could, for example, just take it. And black sets up the same blockade in front of the isolated pawn, and you get this sort of standard position. Okay, enough of that. Let's go back to more common d-pawn positions, but just to show you how often you'll get this kind of position, even in e-pawn. Okay, here's some d4 lines. The Nimzo Indian defense is maybe the most famous for isolated queen-pawn positions, and it's just replete with these kinds of variations. So we'll just look at one main line, which has several ways of getting there in and of itself. This is sort of your basic Nimzo Indian kind of position. And there's all kinds of orders which you can get to this way. For example, here's one way to do it. Here, and there we've got it. We've got the Nimzo Indian. Very similar to the Queen's Gambit and actually to a lot of the things we've already seen, even the Caro-Can. So that's an opening that you'll see quite a bit. Often you'll get this kind of thing, which is worth seeing. And then we have our bishop g5 ideas and other ways to develop. But we've seen something similar to this. A lot of times the bishop will come back here. Okay, so then what else in the Nimzo Indian? Let's start with this same position right here, and let's look at this immediately. Actually, it's almost the same thing. Now, for example, this is one way to play it. Or what else? White could play castles first, and black could take. That would work too. This kind of thing. Again, isolated queen pawn, basic kind of position. White goes like this. Black either plays knight c6 or plays like this, or maybe even plays a6 and b5 to capture more of those light squares on the queen side. Okay, then we might have the Queen's Gambit accepted is another famous way of getting to isolated d-pawn positions. Just for example, well, maybe a good example right off the bat, just a simple one, is here, bishop takes, and then, not that they always play exactly that order, but there you go, isolated d-pawn, and black might just develop and maybe play that to restrain the d-pawn. White puts his pieces on active squares, castles, plays rook e1. Okay, that's one way to do it. A little bit more of a main line would be playing here first, and then, well, let's just look at a really main line with the old a6 and c5 stuff. That would go sort of like this, maybe castles, maybe a6. In the old days, Botvinnik against Petrosian, that kind of thing, they'd play a4. They still do. They play the Furman variation with queen e2. And we get this kind of thing. That would be one isolated pawn right there. Little bit different because the rook's on the d file this time, but very common to put a queen there and a rook on d1. Or if you don't play for some sort of a6 line, there's maybe some simple things like just c takes d4. It's a possibility. And just develop. It's this kind of thing. And you see it again, the same sort of thing. Another system that commonly leads to isolated pawns is the semi-Tarrasch system, and there's many ways to get to that. For example, let's just try, it doesn't really matter, I guess, just play these moves. Pretty soon what happens is black plays c5, white plays e3, and we get this sort of symmetrical position or something similar to it. And probably, well, there's many ways to do this. Here's one way right away, something like this. And if black plays this way, then white can very soon play d takes c5, and black has an isolated pawn, one that we're pretty familiar with. Or maybe white plays, maybe black plays here, and white develops, and black gives white an isolated pawn. So the semi-Tarrasch is just full of all kinds of isolated pawns. And then there's Slav variations, Slav defense variations, like this, and there's a bunch of those too, like in the main or fairly main line. Well, in the semi-Slav, for example, we get from this kind of position. Let's try this line for a second. Maybe, well, okay, so maybe here, takes, castles, maybe usually doesn't go quite this order, but it's quite possible. It has happened here. And again, we have this isolated pawn in front of an outpost. That could be covered by knight b6. And white has a lot of activity. The queen's already got a nice diagonal, and you have rook e1 and bishop g5, same old, same old. Whoops, sorry. Bishop b5, that kind of thing. What else in the Slav? Well, let's see. Maybe if he doesn't play d takes c, for example, maybe just something like, for example, this move. Actually, better get castled first before I make a move like that. Okay. And even now it's a little funny because there's this knight b5 move, but you could just take and isolate the pawn. And this is messy, but maybe it's the same. Maybe white's a little better, but the same idea. Isolated pawn here and blockading square, right, ready for a knight to go on there, and an open file. But great activity. Look, he's aiming at the king, and so we get the same kind of trade-offs that we always get. That's Slav defense, and I'm trying to think what. Well, there's the classical Queen's Gambit. That's worth taking a quick look at. Probably all know this. For example, maybe look at the Lasker variation. That would go something like this. I don't know. This is one way to get to this isolated pawn position. There are actually several. This is an old standard. You can get this from the Capablanca line too, except for the pawn not on h6. And just take my word for it, this is all ancient theory. And now a lot of times white will play that move, and there we go. Isolated pawn. Black can try and swing around and sort of blockade it. It's got an open file. White has some interesting attack here because his rook can zoom over. And we'll see that's quite a theme, especially if you can't get d5 in. A lot of times the rook will transfer in a third rank. This rook. Sometimes the rook even comes over this way from the initial position and swings over. Okay, and there are other, obviously, Queen's Gambit, classical Queen's Gambit things, but they were kind of probably pounding this into the ground here. But let me just look at one more semi-Tarrasch then. We really basically looked at this already. Okay, and there we pretty much have it. Same idea, a little bit different timing because the knight's back here, but we've seen this position before. It's very, very standard kind of position. Okay, that's went on for a while, but I think it's important. So you get some feel for where these things are coming from and why they're so important. So let's go back to the most basic